This might be one of the most recognizable headphones of all time. Let's check it out. Hey, I'm DMS. This is the Headphone Show, and today we're going to be talking about the HD800S from Sennheiser. It's so insanely recognizable. You've probably seen it many times before, and it's not a new headphone. This is a bit of a blast from the audiophile world's past. So let's just jump right into things with build and comfort. The HD800S is a reasonably comfortable headphone. It's lightweight, the ear cups are plenty large on the inside, and there is some padding on top, though that being my biggest complaint, I wish there was more. After about an hour or so, the top of the headband does start to put a little bit of pressure in places I wish it wouldn't. Which isn't to say the headphone is uncomfortable, because compared to many things, it's great. But for some of you watching, well, you might be more sensitive to pressure on the top, and if you are, that's something worth considering. The rest of the build of this headphone, though, is fantastic. Now, it's not as sturdy as something like the Headphone. Yes, I said that right, the HEDD phone. If you want to check that out, by the way, that was my last video I put out. We'll have a link to that. But it's definitely built well enough to deserve the title on top, made in Germany. And a lot of this design isn't just for the sake of aesthetics. A good portion of what you see on this headphone, from the mesh to the way these hinges work, it's all functional. Now, I'm also not a huge fan of the connections used for the detachable cable. I find them to be a bit tough to plug in and unplug, which, I mean, if you catch on your headphones and expect a quick release cable, this isn't gonna do that. This is just gonna pull your headphones right off the desk. As nice as this connector is, I honestly would have just preferred 3.5mm, but it is what it is. The pads are replaceable. They snap on and off with relative ease, though putting them on is a little bit more difficult than getting them off, especially if you get aftermarket pads, but it's not too bad. There, I got those on pretty quick. I would say it's comparable in difficulty to the HD600, 650, or 6XX. Now, these are an open back dynamic and a pretty large dynamic at that, which leads to a lot of this headphone's sound characteristics. So let's talk about sound in two different chapters. We'll start off with subjective sound, and then we'll do objective sound, talk about measurements and frequency response, all that. So, subjective sound. This headphone is very interesting. A lot of you who have heard this headphone before probably know that it has some bright leanings in the upper treble. You probably also know that it has some of the best, if not the best, soundstage in the game. So let's start off with that. The soundstage of this headphone definitely holds up to its reputation. This is my personal unit, one that I've owned for quite some time, and really nothing seems to get quite as wide as this, at least out of all the things that I have listened to, and that's a lot of things. Now, your ears might differ some from mine, and your experience may not be the same. When someone asks me what headphone should I buy if I want the most soundstage, well, it's the HD800S every time. That isn't to say that it's perfect, because it's not. The bass, well, that rolls off very quickly, like many other dynamics do from Sennheiser's open back lineup. I'm not kidding, the sub bass rolls off on this faster than you can say Hammershøi and Muller diffuse field. But it makes up for it with a pretty lush mid-range. The upper mid-range does have a bit of a dip at 2 kHz, which I think is probably one of this headphone's biggest faults, because that dip then rolls up into a bit of a peak in the upper treble. We'll talk more about that in objective sound, but more or less, that upper treble peak is what's responsible for this headphone sometimes sounding bright. It's not as bright as things like a Beyerdynamic T1 or some cheaper Grados, but it's definitely still a headphone I would consider bright. Vocal presence is pretty solid. It's not anywhere near as intimate as something like the HD600, 650, but it still sounds like the singer, when they get right on the mic, is pretty close to your ear. The reverberation afterwards still gives a good sense of space in the room, and clarity throughout all of that remains pretty crisp. If you come into this headphone expecting the exact same staging and vocal presence, though, that you get in the 600 and 650, well, you might be disappointed. But all things considered, I think the experience you get from the 800S in these regards is more realistic and is honestly better. Now, the timbre on the HD800S is interesting. In some ways, it's fantastic, and in some ways, it leaves a little bit to be desired. I would say that on music that won't lean too much into its brighter characteristics and don't rely on its sub-bass performance, well, the timbre sounds extremely natural. But as soon as you start getting into those peaky treble ranges, and as soon as you need that thumpy deep sub bass, well, it starts to sound a little bit thinner, a little bit more tinny. So what does this sound best for? Well, in my personal opinion, I think this thing sounds absolutely the best for orchestral recordings. If you like classical, if you like orchestral, this is going to absolutely shine. Not many things come quite as close to sitting in an actual concert hall as wearing these. Now, I can't quite say the same thing for rock music or for rap, but if you like classical and orchestral, or I'd say even chamber music, this is definitely a strong contender. There are, however, lots of subgenres of electronic and ambient music that sound insane on the HD800S. Specifically anything that's very quick and articulated, because the 800S in itself has a pretty fast attack, especially for a dynamic. A lot of dynamics have more of a tubby bass-leaning sound, and the 800S manages to be quick, manages to be agile, and it manages to be very, very well articulated. Now, it's no planar, but it does seem like the planar of dynamic headphones, with the exception of its bass roll-off, of course. And here's one you might not expect. This actually is one of the best headphones I've ever used for gaming. Yeah, I know, probably not what you'd expect, but because the soundstage is so immersive and because the imaging holds right up there with the soundstage and is laser focused sharp, I can tell where everything's coming from. So if I'm not using something like the PC38X, well, oftentimes I like to use something like this, especially if the game is competitive. Now let's talk about objective sound, and then we're going to talk about amp pairing and my conclusions on this headphone. So I have a graph pulled up here. This is off my home rig. It's worth noting this rig is not perfect, and the target we see here, this green line, is basically an adapted version of Harman for my rig without the base shelf. The blue is the raw measurement, and then the red line here is the compensated measurement. So if the red line is flat, then the headphone is flat to my target. And here's what we see. Just like we were talking about, there's roll-off in the bass. The mid-range has some warmth, but is overall relatively linear until we get to 1000 Hertz, and then it starts to dip down. I feel like in the range of 1500 Hertz to 2 kilohertz is where this dip is experienced the most. It doesn't bother me quite as much at 3K. But then we get to the elephant in the room, the 6 kilohertz peak on the HD800S. It's there on almost any rig you measure this headphone with, and it is definitely obvious when listening. Now, as I mentioned, it's not as bright as something like a Bayer T1, or say a DT880, or some cheaper Grados, which we'll be talking about in the future. But as you can see here, that treble peak does elevate above the mid-range, and it is nothing to laugh at. That peak is definitely there, and it's definitely something that will be a deal breaker for some people. Aside from that, the headphone is relatively linear. It's not crazy far out of targets, but it's definitely not something I would describe as a super target adherent headphone either. Still decent for objectivists though, because this headphone does take very well to EQ, and with that, let's talk about amplification and sources. This is a 300 ohm dynamic, as mentioned before. Because it's both high impedance and a dynamic, well, you get an interesting combination, whereas being a dynamic, it's relatively easy to power. Not super easy, but relatively easy. But since it's high impedance, you can power this off tube amps. Now, whether or not you're into that, that's up to you. You might plug it into a solid state amp and love it. And there are some solid state amps I highly recommend this with, but man, high impedance Sennheiser on tubes really delivers a different experience. I'm not gonna recommend any particular tube amp here, but something OTL can definitely take advantage of the high impedance of this, and you don't have to spend a lot of money on a tube amp before you really get that sound. Something else you can do that I actually highly recommend with this headphone is something like the Lokius. A funny name, I know. That's basically a desktop equalizer, a bunch of little knobs, and you can set it there, plug it up in line between your DAC and your amp, and you can tweak the bass up a little bit, turn down that treble around 6K, maybe bring 2K back up a little bit too, and get a really good experience out of this headphone that's pretty target adherent with minimal effort. That is one of my favorite ways to use this. But if you don't want to spend that much money on your setup, you've already spent a lot on the headphone, I get that, check out the JDS Labs Element 3. That actually brings out the bass of the HD800 pretty nicely. Now, I'm not reviewing that DAC amp today, but just know that is coming at some point in the future, and I really, really like it. And between all the things in my collection, well, I'd say if I had to pick one amp for the HD800S, it would probably be the Element 3. So then, conclusions on the HD800S. It's a headphone that is not perfect. It has some flaws, it has some peaky treble, and it has bass roll-off that's pretty intense. But the soundstage technicalities, imaging, and lightweight nature of this headphone make it a no-brainer for my collection. I've tried to sell this headphone 3 times, and 3 times I've bought it again because no matter what, I always end up missing the HD800S out of my collection. I think I've learned my mistake. It's in my collection to stay. So do I recommend the HD800S? Well, it's expensive. Maybe not as your only headphone unless the things I described are the exact sound you're after, but if you have a collection, if you already have a couple high-end headphones, if you want something in your collection that takes that extra step in soundstage and imaging, well, the HD800S is the obvious answer. And I'm glad I got to talk about it today. That, though, is going to wrap up today's video. If you want to talk more about this headphone, there'll be a link to the community forums in the video description. Other than that, if you like this video, leave a like down below, comment, letting me know what you want to see from us in the future and you want to see me talk about and review. As always, I'm DMS. Thank you for watching the Headphone Show. Stick around, subscribe, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.